Imagine living in a world where a stolen kiss, a whispered promise in the dark, or a fleeting touch could cost you your life. A world where love was not just dangerous, but deadly. In the Middle Ages, adultery was not simply a sin whispered in confession. It was a crime that could unleash the most horrific punishments you can imagine. From brutal public shaming to tortures designed to break the body and soul. The medieval obsession with controlling desire created some of the darkest spectacles of justice ever recorded. And in this video, we're going to pull back the curtain on the chilling reality of what happened to those who dared to break the sacred vows of marriage. You'll hear stories of noblewomen humiliated in the streets, men mutilated in ways that would make even hardened warriors tremble, and the twisted punishments designed by both church and state to make adultery an unforgettable warning to everyone else. But before we dive in, if you love exploring the darkest, strangest, and most disturbing truths of medieval history, then make sure to subscribe to our channel, Past of Medieval. It helps us bring you more of these stories hidden in the shadows of time and, trust me, the journey we're about to take is one you won't forget. So let's step into the brutal world of medieval justice, where passion could turn to horror overnight. We begin with one of the most common punishments of all, public humiliation. In many medieval towns, if a man or woman was caught committing adultery, they would be paraded through the streets, often stripped to the waist, tied to a cart, or even forced to wear bizarre costumes that marked them as sinners. The jeering crowd would pelt them with mud, rotten vegetables, and worse, as they stumbled in shame. For many, this punishment wasn't just painful, it destroyed reputations, ruined families, and made survival in tight-knit medieval communities nearly impossible. But humiliation was just the beginning. Some towns devised punishments that were far more cruel and creative. In Germany, adulterous women were sometimes forced to shave their heads, a devastating mark of disgrace, in a world where hair symbolized beauty and status. In France, an adulterous man might have his nose cut off, a permanent reminder of his crime. And if you think that sounds extreme, just wait, because in the hands of medieval lords, kings, and even the church itself, the punishments for adultery could spiral into something truly horrific. Public humiliation might seem bad enough, but in the Middle Ages, some punishments for adultery went far beyond shame. They were designed not only to punish the guilty, but to terrify anyone even thinking of breaking their vows. One of the most infamous punishments was mutilation. In many parts of Europe, the body itself became a canvas for justice. Men accused of adultery might have their genitals mutilated or even castrated, an act meant to permanently erase the possibility of further sin. For women, the punishments were just as cruel. In some regions, a woman caught in adultery could have her nose or ears cut off, branding her face forever with the mark of dishonor. Imagine walking through a village where every scar told a story of betrayal, lust, and punishment. It was a medieval way of turning the body into a warning. But mutilation wasn't just about punishment, it was about control. The church and local authorities wanted to make sure no one forgot the price of stepping outside the rigid rules of medieval marriage. And mutilation wasn't always carried out in private. It could be staged before an eager crowd, where villagers watched as the adulterer's punishment unfolded in brutal detail. In England, the law sometimes allowed a husband to punish his adulterous wife himself. There are chilling records of women being beaten, whipped, or even locked in the stocks for days as their husbands publicly declared their betrayal. In Italy, there were cases where jealous husbands executed their wives and were later acquitted, because society considered a woman's infidelity an unforgivable stain on a man's honor. Honor was everything in the Middle Ages, and adultery was seen as more than a private betrayal. It was a crime that could threaten families, property, and even political alliances. And because of this, the punishments could become disturbingly theatrical. For instance, in some parts of France and Germany, adulterous couples were forced to march through the streets together, bound at the waist, often half naked, and sometimes even tied to each other's genitals. The message was clear. Their forbidden union had brought them shame, and now they would suffer that shame in public until everyone had seen it. And then there was the punishment of drowning. In certain regions, especially in Central Europe, women caught in adultery could be tied in sacks, sometimes with snakes, cats, or other animals, and thrown into rivers. The idea was both execution and spectacle, a brutal cleansing ritual meant to wash away the sin. As horrifying as these punishments sound, they revealed just how obsessed medieval society was with controlling love, desire, and sexuality. The church preached that marriage was sacred, but beneath that ideal lay a world of fear, cruelty, and violence waiting for anyone who strayed. But if you think this was the worst of it, hold on, because in some cases, adultery wasn't punished by the lash or by humiliation. It was punished by death. Death's ultimate punishment was often the fate of adulterers in the Middle Ages. While some rulers and towns preferred humiliation or mutilation, others saw no point in mercy. To them, adultery was not just a sin but a direct threat to the fabric of Christian society. And in that world, the punishment had to match the crime. One of the most common executions for adultery was burning alive. For women in particular, fire became the instrument of so-called justice. It was seen as both a punishment and a purification ritual, the flames destroying the sinful body while, in theory, cleansing the soul. Imagine being dragged into the town square, bound to a stake, with crowds gathering to watch as the flames rose higher. For some, the fire consumed both body and reputation in a single, horrifying display. But burning wasn't the only way. In parts of Germany, adulterers were buried alive. Men and women accused of infidelity were sometimes forced into a pit, covered with earth, and left to suffocate slowly. The burial was often done in public, with villagers gathered around to witness the sinner's last breaths. Other regions were even more inventive. In parts of Italy and Spain, records describe adulterers being stoned to death by angry crowds, echo of biblical punishments that reinforced the church's authority. In some medieval towns, a husband who caught his wife with another man could legally kill them both on the spot and not face any charges. The law, in a sense, handed men the power of life and death over women's fidelity. Perhaps the most chilling form of punishment, however, was when lovers were executed together. There are chronicles that describe men and women bound face to face or back to back and thrown into rivers, lakes, or pits. Their sinful union was turned into a grotesque death sentence, forever linking them in infamy. Take, for example, a 14th century case in Augsburg, Germany, where an adulterous couple was sewn into a sack and drowned in the Danube. The symbolism was deliberate. The lovers who had defied the sacred laws of marriage would now die locked in each other's arms. An eternal warning to others who might be tempted. What makes these stories even more haunting is that they were not rare exceptions. Across Europe, towns and kingdoms used executions for adultery as both punishment and spectacle. The goal wasn't just to kill it, was to send a message, to terrify others into obedience. And yet, not everyone was treated equally. A poor woman might burn for her betrayal, while a wealthy noblewoman could sometimes buy her way out with money, influence, or the protection of her family. The same crime could mean death for one person and a mere fine for another, reminding us that in the Middle Ages, justice was often as cruel as it was unfair. But here's the twist. Not every adulterer faced the executioner's hand. Some found themselves trapped in a punishment far stranger and, in many ways, even more degrading than death. Because in medieval Europe, adultery wasn't just about law and punishment. It was about control, morality, and the endless ways the powerful twisted sexuality into a weapon. Not every adulterer in the Middle Ages was executed. In fact, for many, the punishment was humiliation, public, brutal, and unforgettable. These punishments were designed not only to shame the sinner, but also to remind the entire community of the moral order. One of the most infamous was the cucking stool. If a woman was accused of infidelity, she might be strapped into a wooden chair attached to a long beam. Then, in front of jeering neighbors, she was dunked repeatedly into a river or pond. The icy water, the laughter of the crowd, and the humiliation of being paraded as a moral failure left scars that could last a lifetime. Men, too, occasionally suffered this fate, though far less often. Then there was the dreaded shaming parade. An adulterer might be stripped to the waist, tied to a donkey, and paraded through town, wearing grotesque symbols of their crime. In some regions, women were forced to wear a straw, crown a symbol of lust and shame, while men might have a rope of straw around their necks, marking them as faithless lovers. Villagers spat through rotten food and shouted curses as the condemned were led through the streets. Some towns took things even further, with a punishment known as pairing. If caught together, adulterous lovers could be stripped naked, tied together, and forced to walk through the streets locked in an embrace. Their supposed sinful passion was turned into public ridicule, their bodies displayed as objects of scorn. but humiliation could be mixed with violence. In certain areas, adulterers were whipped publicly before being banished. A man might be flogged at the marketplace while townsfolk cheered, or a woman might be beaten before being forced to leave her village forever. In some German territories, the punishment was even harsher. Women had their hair shaved off a visible and lasting mark of dishonor. Baldness became a living reminder of their so-called sin. And in France, particularly during the medieval period, courts sometimes sentenced adulterers to a truly bizarre penalty, having their noses cut off. The nose, seen as a symbol of beauty and honor, was hacked away, leaving a permanent disfigurement. This punishment was designed not just to wound the body, but to destroy the sinner's reputation. With a mutilated face, they could never hide their crime. One chilling account from 13th century Paris tells of a woman caught with a neighbor. Instead of execution, the court ruled her nose should be cut off in front of her husband. The man, meanwhile, was flogged in the streets. Both survived, but they lived as walking reminders of their punishment. It's worth noting how often these punishments targeted women. While men did suffer for adultery, especially if they were poor or lacked connections, women bore the harsher sentences: burnings, mutilations, shavings, humiliations. Why? Because in the medieval worldview, women's sexuality was seen as both dangerous and disruptive. Controlling it was not only about morality, but also about property, inheritance, and male honor. But here's where the story grows even more disturbing. Not all of these punishments came from secular courts. Many were sanctioned or even enforced by the church. Because for a medieval adulterer, eternal damnation could be considered a punishment far worse than public ridicule, mutilation, or even death, while secular rulers imposed flogging, mutilation, or death. The church brought its own arsenal of punishments that reached into the soul. For a medieval man or woman, this was often even more terrifying. After all, while a lost limb or a scarred face might ruin your life on earth, the church held the power to damn you for eternity. Confession was one of the main tools. Adulterers were required to confess their sins to a priest, who would then impose harsh penances. These were not light punishments. A guilty woman might be ordered to fast on bread and water for weeks, sleep on the floor of a cold church, or walk barefoot on pilgrimages hundreds of miles long. Men were sometimes sentenced to wear rough woolen penitential garments that scratched and burned the skin day and night. But worse than penance was excommunication. If the church deemed an adulterer unrepentant, they could be cut off from the sacraments, denied burial in consecrated ground, and shunned by the entire community. In medieval society, where salvation was everything, this was a fate worse than death. To be excommunicated meant being treated as already damned and outcast, both in life and in the afterlife. There were even cases where priests forced adulterers to stand at the doors of the church, half naked, while parishioners spat on them as they entered for Mass. Others had to carry heavy crosses through the streets, reenacting Christ's passion, but marked as sinners rather than saints. In some monasteries, penance took a truly sadistic turn. Manuscripts tell of monks forcing adulterers to crawl on their hands and knees for miles, licking the ground in humility. Women caught in infidelity were sometimes ordered to lie prostrate at the church altar for hours, while the congregation stepped over them. Imagine the weight of that humiliation, the entire community literally walking across your body as a symbol of your disgrace. The church also used fear of eternal punishment as a weapon. Medieval sermons vividly described adulterers burning in hell, tormented by demons who endlessly reenacted their sinful acts with fire and iron. In one famous 12th century text, adulterous men were said to have their genitals eternally gnawed by serpents, while adulterous women had their breasts consumed by flames. These were not abstract images, they were hammered into the minds of parishioners week after week, ensuring that even the thought of adultery carried a weight of dread. But here lies the cruel paradox. While the church claimed to be protecting morality, its obsession with controlling sex created systems that were deeply unequal. Wealthy noblemen and even priests often escaped with light penances, while poor women bore the full brunt of humiliation and violence. And perhaps the darkest irony of all, many of the very priests and bishops who enforced these punishments were themselves notorious for breaking their vows of celibacy. Chronicles from the Middle Ages are filled with reports of priests keeping mistresses, bishops fathering children, and even popes entangled in scandal. Yet when ordinary people strayed, the hammer of punishment fell hardest. This hypocrisy left ordinary men and women trapped. Adultery was condemned, but loveless or forced marriages were common. Women especially were treated as property, often married off as teenagers to much older men. When they sought affection elsewhere, they risked mutilation, humiliation, or eternal damnation. And the more we look into specific case studies, the more disturbing the stories become. Some of the most shocking punishments weren't even official laws, but acts of raw vengeance carried out under the cloak of morality. One of the most infamous cases comes from 13th century France. A noblewoman was accused of committing adultery with a knight while her husband was away on campaign. When the affair was discovered, the husband demanded justice. Instead of a quiet execution, he staged a trial by ordeal in front of his retainers. The woman was forced to walk barefoot over burning plowshares. Her feet blistered instantly, and when she collapsed, her husband declared her guilty. She was dragged to the village square and publicly flogged, before being locked in a convent for the rest of her life. Her lover, the knight, was hanged outside the castle walls. In Germany, chroniclers describe a punishment so cruel it became infamous across Europe: the cucking stool. This device was used for adulterous women nagging wives, or so-called immoral women. The guilty woman would be strapped into a chair attached to a long beam and dunked repeatedly into a freezing river or muddy pond, sometimes until she lost consciousness. Crowds would jeer and laugh, treating her pain as entertainment. The humiliation often caused permanent illness, and in some cases, women drowned when guards lost control of the chair. But it wasn't only women who faced disgrace. In Italy, records survive of men who committed adultery, being paraded naked through the streets with donkey ears attached to their heads, a symbol of foolishness and shame. Some had their clothes torn and genitals bound with ropes, while townsfolk pelted them with rotten vegetables. Yet even more terrifying were the cases where punishment escalated into torture and mutilation. In the Byzantine Empire, adultery was sometimes punished with castration for men and nose-cutting for women. By destroying a woman's face, authorities ensured she would never again be seen as beautiful, branding her as a permanent outcast. Men, meanwhile, were stripped of their masculinity and ability to father children. These punishments weren't hidden, they were designed to be visible scars, lifelong reminders of sin. One chilling story comes from England in the 14th century. A miller's wife, accused of sleeping with a local priest, was dragged through the streets by a rope tied around her neck. Villagers spat on her, and some struck her with sticks as she stumbled past. Her lover, the priest, was quietly reassigned to another parish, while she was thrown into prison, where she died within months. It was a stark example of how gender inequality made punishments vastly harsher for women. And in Spain, cases from the Inquisition show even more gruesome outcomes. Adulterous women could be sentenced to wear iron masks with spikes inside the mouth, preventing them from speaking or eating comfortably. They were forced to wear these devices for days or even weeks until their mouths bled. Such punishments blurred the line between justice and sadistic torture, showing how adultery was treated not just as a moral failing, but as a crime to be crushed through suffering. What makes all of this even more horrifying is how much of it was done in public. Punishments for adultery were performances of power, whether through flogging, mutilation, or humiliation. The goal was not only to punish the guilty, but also to terrify the innocent. By witnessing such cruelty, ordinary men and women were constantly reminded of the price of temptation. And yet, despite these punishments, adultery never disappeared. In fact, it was rampant in medieval Europe, hidden in shadows, whispered in taverns, confessed behind closed doors. The gap between human desire and brutal morality made the act of adultery both a deadly risk and a forbidden thrill. In the Middle Ages, class determined everything. If you were a peasant caught in adultery, your life was ruined. But if you were a noble lord, even a king, the rules bent in your favor. For common women, punishments ranged from whippings to mutilations, sometimes even death. A farmer's wife in 14th century England was hanged for adultery after her husband demanded justice. But a noblewoman caught in the same act might only be confined to a convent or forced to donate her wealth to the church as penance. In short, the higher your status, the easier it was to escape the whip or the executioner's axe. Men had even more leeway. A nobleman could keep mistresses openly, and if caught, society rarely punished him at all. But if his wife strayed, the consequences were catastrophic. Chronicles from France describe men who killed their adulterous wives with impunity, their actions excused as defense of honor. Meanwhile, women had no such rights. If a wife discovered her husband's infidelity, she had little recourse. Speaking out often meant she was branded a shrew or accused of being unfaithful herself. The church also played a decisive role in shaping these punishments. Priests preached that adultery was a sin against God, but in practice, the church treated men and women very differently. Priests themselves were notorious for breaking their vows of celibacy and bedding parishioners. When discovered, they were often relocated or ordered to fast and pray. But women caught with clergy could be excommunicated, shamed, or worse, burned as whores of the devil. One disturbing example comes from 15th century Italy. A wealthy merchant was caught in an affair with a young maid. When the scandal broke, he was fined and quickly returned to his business. The maid, however, was stripped naked, beaten through the streets, and forced to wear a sign reading, "Adulteress." She lived the rest of her life in poverty, rejected by family and community alike. Even kings played a role in turning adultery into spectacle. King Philip IV of France once ordered an infamous purge of noblewomen accused of sleeping with their husbands' knights. These women were arrested, beaten, and imprisoned for life. Their lovers. They were tortured, castrated, and executed in public squares. Royal scandals were often the most brutal because they threatened not just family honor, but the stability of entire dynasties. But the most chilling fact remains. Gender and class turned adultery into a weapon. Men used accusations of infidelity to control women, silence rivals, or seize property. The church used it to instill fear and obedience, and rulers used it to crush threats to their power. In many cases, whether a person lived or died depended less on the act itself and more on who they were. It is in this hypocrisy that we see the darkest truth about medieval morality. Adultery was condemned not because it broke vows of love, but because it disrupted power, order, and control. And for that, countless men and women, often the powerless, paid with blood, pain, and humiliation. When we peel back the layers of medieval punishments for adultery, we don't find justice, we find fear, power, and control. Every whipping, every public shaming, every execution was less about morality and more about keeping society in line. For ordinary women, adultery was often a death sentence, whether through execution, exile, or social ruin. For men, it was usually a stain that could be washed away with money, influence, or silence. Nobles and clergy often lived above the very laws they enforced, their sins quietly erased, while commoners bore the harshest penalties. And yet, what's most disturbing is not just the brutality, but the hypocrisy. The very same church that demanded purity and obedience hid countless scandals behind monastery walls. The very same kings, who condemned adultery to protect family honor, kept mistresses in secret chambers. The very same men who preached virtue weaponized shame and violence against women, while excusing themselves of every sin. In the end, adultery in the Middle Ages was not simply about love, betrayal, or lust. It was about power. Who controlled the body, who controlled the reputation, and ultimately, who controlled life and death. And that's what makes these punishments so horrific. They were never about justice, but about domination. So, the next time we think of medieval romance, chivalry, or courtly love, we must also remember the darker side, the broken vows, punished with blood, the double standards that destroyed lives, and the cruelty masked as morality. Because beneath the glittering image of knights and castles lies a far more chilling truth. A world where love could be a crime, and desire could lead to your doom. If you found this dive into the hidden horrors of medieval life fascinating, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Past in Medieval, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another journey into history's darkest secrets.